Several months ago, there was this little trend going on social media, particularly Facebook, in which people were being asked to name their 10 all time favorite albums. And given my reputation as being just a teeny bit of a music geek, I got asked a few times. But, instead of making things easy on myself and just firing 10 random albums off the top of my head, I figured maybe I should try a little harder. And indeed, why would I ever be timely about anything either? So here's the deal. I was able to come up with that list of 10 albums, but in whittling things down, I wound up with another list of 10 that I just could not throw out. So with that, I'm actually going to divide this into two parts. So today we're going to take a look at 5 of those top 10 favorite albums, but also 5 honorable mentions. And then next time, it'll be in a couple of weeks after the next regular archive episode, I'll come back and finish everything up. And otherwise, let's get down to business here. Here are my 10 all-time favorite albums and 10 honorable mentions in no particular order. Subtitle, God, doesn't Ben listen to anything from this century? To which the answer is no, not really. Indeed, nothing you're going to see in either of these two parts dates to any later than 1985. Honorable mention number 1. My Aim is True by Elvis Costello. I know it's cool to bash anything of Costello's that doesn't feature some variation of the Attractions, but this is my favorite of Costello's albums for one simple reason. He never wrote another batch of songs as good as this again, though he came close. Honorable mention number 2. Hounds of Love by Kate Bush. A genuine vinyl/cassette era sort of album. One side is comprised of, by her standards, fairly accessible pop, and one side devoted to a mini concept album called The Ninth Wave, which seems to be about a night's worth of thoughts going through the head of someone stranded at sea, while in the water. Pink Floyd with a Woman's Touch is the best way I can describe this one, which is kind of apt given that David Gilmour was an early supporter. Honorable mention number 3. Fear of the Unknown by Martin BRILEY. Now for the more obscure stuff. Martin BRILEY was a survivor of the 70s progressive rock movement and had also functioned as Ian Hunter's touring bassist for a while. BRILEY's first solo album, the one I'm talking about, is an album of cynical prog pop with a warped sense of humor. This one bombed spectacularly at the time of release. As far as I know, it didn't chart anywhere in the world. And sadly, it hasn't built up much of a cult following since then. I can only guess that this one is too pop for most progressive fans and too progressive for most pop fans. This one's only ever been reissued as the first 10 tracks of BRILEY's Mercury Years mini-boxed set. Honorable mention number 4. Hard Labor by Three Dog Night. I guess I just have a soft spot for albums by crumbling bands. See also Creedence Clearwater Revival's Mardi Gras. In this case, Three Dog Night was in the middle of its lengthy demise. In the process, they came up with this little gem, which is by turns beautiful and brutal, punctuated by the odd flushing toilet sound. The Dogs knew that they were trapped in an unintentional circus at the time, but also knew that, as the song goes, the show must go on. This album, and cover, captures that dark and cynical mood perfectly. This wound up being their last hit album, and maybe they should have called it quits then and there. They made 2 more albums before breaking up, and they sucked. Honorable mention number 5. Moving Targets by Flo and Eddie. Speaking of dark and cynical, this album by former Turtles frontmen Howard Kaylan and Mark Volman may very well be the definitive satirical pop album, which isn't surprising given the then still ongoing legal battles that had plagued them since the Turtles' demise, which left them unable to so much as use their own legal names when performing. This album careens from vicious snipes at the music industry to pop so sweet and gentle it could almost fly on an episode of Sesame Street, and it hits nearly every point in between. Back in my own music days, this was kind of my musical manifesto. And now on to the first 5 of my 10 all-time favorite albums, in no particular order. Number 1. Cosmos Factory by Creedence Clearwater Revival. 11 tracks, 7 of which rightly became hits. Commercial achievement aside, John Fogerty really upped his game on this one. The original songs are a bit more ambitious, the covers have a little more direction than they had had in the past, the more jammed out tracks were more intense, and everything feels like it has a genuine purpose. See also the albums that led up to this one, namely Green River and Willie and the Poor Boys. Number 2. Countdown to Ecstasy by Steely Dan. I think I can safely say that when most folks think of Steely Dan, they think of ultra-precise, ultra-glossy productions with more than a little jazz going on. And I like that stuff too, but this album is really a total anomaly in the Dan catalog. This was only the group's second album, and they were actually still more or less a regular band at this point, as opposed to Donald Fagen, Walter Becker, and an army of studio musicians. The arrangements are the most ragged of their career, the songs are the hardest rocking, but also, it's just their best batch of songs. There's no hit singles here, nor is it an easy album, but it's a very rewarding experience for the adventurous. A bit of useless trivia: I put a little nod to the song King of the World in the Protect and Survive episode of Oddity Archive. See if you can spot it. Number 3. Closing Time by Tom Waits. So sue me, I'm kind of indifferent to the later, more artsy Tom Waits albums. I have long held a soft spot for Tom's Barstool Philosopher years. I'm talking 1973 to 82. This was Tom's first album. He hadn't developed the Cookie Monster voice yet, nor the warped, often dark sense of humor, nor had he developed his penchant for using odd, esoteric instrumentation. This is actually a fairly straight singer-songwriter album, albeit a much more raw and understated record than most put out by the 70s singer-songwriters. The title is especially appropriate, as this is very much a lonely, late-night sort of album. All but one of the tracks are ballads. I don't think Tom has ever made a more unified and certainly not a more beautiful album than this one. Number 4. Pure Pop for Now People, or Jesus of Cool, by Nick Lowe. This was the first full solo album by ex-Brinsley Schwarz bassist singer-songwriter Nick Lowe. In that group, Lowe had developed a knack for terrific, albeit lyrically bent pop. After the Brinsleys broke up, Lowe took the more warped tendencies of his work and cranked it to 11, leaving a lengthy trail of one-offs, singles, and an EP over a span of 3 years. During this time, Lowe had landed the job as house producer for the newly founded Stiff Records, which favored the then burgeoning punk movement. When this album was first released in the UK, it was called Jesus of Cool, and it was a collection of some of those one-offs plus some new recordings, albeit favoring the more punk tendencies that Lowe had picked up. For the album's US release, it was retitled Pure Pop for Now People, because the old title might have offended someone, I guess. The album was also reconfigured for this release, favoring Lowe's more pop tendencies. And this is how I first heard this album, when I found an old LP of it around the time I graduated high school. Honestly, I kind of prefer the US version, as it has a more freewheeling vibe to it. However, the UK version is excellent in its own right, and this has since become the standard version of this album. A killer album any way you slice or title it. Number 5. Warren Zevon by Warren Zevon. Like most Zevonites, I started with his Excitable Boy album, because, Werewolves of London. This was my second Zevon album, and my 15-year-old brain didn't really get it at first. However, it quickly became not just my favorite of Zevon's albums, but just one of my favorites, period. Whether intentional or not, this seems to be a bit of a musical autobiography for Warren, at times detailing his own personality, and at other times projecting it by way of characters. Admittedly, the arrangements are a tad ill-formed at times, but Zevon himself always sells the songs through and through. As for the songs themselves, to me, they're flawless. Well, that's it for the first half of my lists. Join me in a couple of weeks when I finish up my "God, Ben, you're so predictable" list.